Hi, General Psych students. It's Dr. Mendez-Baldwin here with another mini lecture. I'd like to talk about is how psychologists and other scientists study the brain. So we're in a very fortunate position nowadays. Modern technology has led to the development of a variety of different instruments and tools and diagnostic machinery that can allow us to study the human brain. And this is really great because in the early history of psychology, we didn't have these sophisticated, technologically savvy machines at our disposal. And we had to learn about the brain in some rather rude and unsophisticated ways, right? So let's start off with how we used to study the brain, and then let's talk about how we study it today. So before the creation of modern technological diagnostic machinery, what we used to do was we would study the brain by looking at case studies. So we would look at individuals who had unique circumstances, either because they were extremely gifted and represented genius ability, or because they were on the other end of the spectrum and were very deficient in their abilities. And we did case studies on them, and we waited until these people died. And when these people died, we analyzed and looked at their brains via autopsy. And we compared those to the brains that had been donated from people that died that were just regular Joes who didn't have, these atypical brains because of genius ability or deficient abilities or because of horrible accidents that they had experienced. They were just average people who had died and donated their brains to science. And we would then compare the brains of the atypical individual to that of the normal individual. And whatever differences we saw, we made a conclusion that those differences somehow were involved in this individual's genius ability or this individual's, deficient ability. So that leads to a lot of conclusions that may not be accurate, right? Another way that we used to study the brain, believe it or not, was by altering the brain. So if there was an individual who had some sort of behavioral pattern or tendency that was considered to be atypical or dangerous, or deviant, a lot of times these people were put in mental hospitals. And in order to treat their behavioral patterns, a lot of times what was done was that their brain was altered. And this is not something that, we're proud of, in the history of psychology. This is an example of some very harmful behaviors that scientists engaged in. But at the time, it was all that was known, right? So, for example, if someone was in the hospital because they were extremely aggressive and they weren't responding to drug treatment, what would be done is that the part of their brain that they thought was involved in aggression from those case studies that we just talked about were altered by being taken out of the brain, right? So we thought somebody was too aggressive or sexually maladaptive or too emotional, or engaged in some compulsion that was unhealthy, and we took out the piece of the brain that we thought was responsible for that behavior. And after the surgical alteration, if the person's behavior changed, we would say, oh yeah, you see, we were right. We took out the right part. And if we were wrong, they said, oh, well, that wasn't it. Let's try taking out another part. Right? So basically they were performing brain lobotomies, right? Sometimes they wouldn't take the entire piece of the brain out. Instead, they would just perform electric shock therapy on the individual. And by administering high levels of electricity, they basically would kill that part of the brain that they thought was involved in this particular behavior. And this was done without any kind of technology that allowed us to visually see what we were doing. And a lot of mistakes took place and a lot of people's lives were altered significantly, right? So sometimes when you hear about people who have certain biases against psychology, when you hear people that say, oh, psychologists don't know what they're doing, or psychologists are barbaric, a lot of that stems from some of the practices that took place in the early history of psychology. And some of these things like electric shock therapy and lobotomies were being performed in the 1940s, okay? So you guys may have, grandparents or great-grandparents who kind of experienced this type of stuff, okay? So it kind of helps you to understand why there are some people that still have, not embraced the science of psychology as it is today, okay? Even earlier than this, there was a very interesting approach to studying the brain called phrenology. And what they would do is that they would actually feel people's heads. What is this? They would feel people's heads and look at the bumps and grooves in the person's skull. And then based on what they felt, they would make conclusions as to their abilities. So if this piece was kind of big and they thought this piece was involved in creativity based on, the donated brain of a creative genius who had died, and under autopsy we noticed that brain segment was large, we would feel somebody say, oh, they're very creative. Again, not very scientific, but this was what was done. Luckily today we have a lot more sophisticated techniques, right? We have one technique called an electroencephalograph, an EEG. An electroencephalograph is very similar to an EKG, an electrocardiogram. Right? So you may have had an electrocardiogram performed if you ever had to have, clearance for any kind of surgery or anything like that. And it involved, right, putting these sticky little pads around your chest. And those sticky pads had these electrical wires that were attached to a machine, and it would generate an image, a scan, an electrical scan of your heart's electrical activity, right? Well, an EEG, an electroencephalograph, is very similar, except that the sticky electrodes are put on your head, right? Or sometimes there's a headband that you wear that looks like a little crown or something. And from that stems all of the little wires, and it goes to a computer and it reads the electrical activity of your brain. So it shows you the different brain waves that are taking place when you're, for example, in different stages of sleep, or when you're thinking about, a painful memory, or when you're trying to recall the definition of a word. Okay. So that's the electroencephalograph, and it's used a lot in sleep studies, right? And there's a picture of an electroencephalograph in your PowerPoint for this week. So take a look at that. Another technique that is used to study the brain is called a PET scan, positron emission tomography. And a PET scan is a little bit more of an intrusive procedure because it involves either ingesting a substance that is radioactive or injecting a substance with a radioactive dye into your vein that then travels to the different parts of your brain and produces these really nice color-coded images of the brain. And it shows us where there is a lot of brain activity because the glucose and the oxygen in your brain attach to these radioactive substances, right? So that's a PET scan. And there are some pictures of some PET scans on your PowerPoint as well. So I refer you to those. And then lastly is the MRI, right? Magnetic resonance imaging. And you guys, especially if any of your athletes, may have had an MRI, right? Where you are seated or asked to lay down in this thing that looks like a bed, and it goes through a tunnel, right? And it is very loud because you hear the sounds of the magnetic fields that are bombarding the tube, right? And the beauty of the MRI is that it creates multiple highly detailed cross-section pictures of the brain that then can be put together, and now with 3D printers, sometimes we can actually take those scans and put them together and create a model of what your brain looks like. So it's pretty cool. Okay. Alrighty, guys. Till next time.